Donovan Phillips Leitch, born at the 10th May 1946, known mononymously as Donovan, is a Scottish musician, songwriter, and record producer. He developed an eclectic and distinctive style that blended folk, jazz, pop, psychedelic rock, and world music, notably calypso. He has lived in Scotland, Hertfordshire, London, California, and since at least 2008 in County Cork, Ireland, with his family.
Yellow is the color of my true love's hair in the morning when we rise. In the morning when we rise, that's the time, that's the time I love the best.
There was a folk invasion of the American charts by Joan Baez and Peter, Paul and Mary. So I saw that. I thought, I want to be part of that. I knew that I was going to do it. I intended. And I was reading Buddhism and Celtic philosophy. And now I wanted to be the voice, like Joan was, like Peter, Paul and Mary. I knew that I could bring in meaningful lyrics into popular culture.
He made his very first appearance on Ready, Steady, Go, and I'm terribly proud of him because I think he's come up so quickly. You know, he's only been going for about 3 months. I think it's marvellous. And I hate people who say he's a copy of Dylan because I think he's very talented in his own right.
I think you've given the game away. Tell us who it is.
It's sensational Donovan.
This is called Catch the Wind. In the chilly hours and minutes of uncertainty, I want to be in the warm heart of your love and mine.
Gypsy Dave said, I found a new record by a new American artist and he's doing exactly what you're doing. I said, what am I doing? He said, you're doing Woody Guthrie with a cap and a harmonica. I said, well, who is this guy? He says, well, he's called Bob Dylan. So I said, send me his record. So he sent down Freewheelin' Bob Dylan. And when I put it on, I said, yeah, he's doing it as well. Some people did say, oh, they've dressed him up, they put a cap on him. They couldn't believe that I really was a vagabond, that I'd really left society, turned my back on it, challenging hypocrisy and greed, becoming a bohemian to sing about society's ills.
Emerging from the British folk scene, Donovan reached fame in the United Kingdom in early 1965 with live performances on the pop TV series Ready, Steady, Go. Having signed with Pye Records in 1965, he recorded singles and 2 albums in the folk vein for Hickory Records, after which he signed to CBS Epic in the US, the first signing by the company's new vice president, Clive Davis, and became more successful internationally. He began a long and successful collaboration with leading British independent record producer Mickie Most, scoring multiple hit singles and albums in the UK, US, and other countries. He emerged onto the scene in 1965 with 3 UK hit singles, Catch the Wind, Colors, and Universal Soldier, the last written by Buffy Sainte-Marie. In September 1966, Sunshine Superman topped America's Billboard Hot 100 chart for 1 week and went to number 2 in Britain, followed by Mellow Yellow at US number 2 in December 1966, then 1968's Hurdy-Gurdy Man in the top 5 in both countries, and then Atlantis, which reached US number 7 in May 1969. The compilation Donovan's Greatest Hits was released in March 1969 and peaked at number 4 on the Billboard 200. Donovan became a friend of pop and folk musicians such as Joan Baez, Brian Jones, and the Beatles. He taught John Lennon a finger-picking guitar style in 1968 that Lennon employed in Dear Prudence, Julia, Happiness is a Warm Gun, and other songs.
And then the story is now all over the world how in India John Lennon was fascinated by this guitar style. When we relaxed enough into the jungle, right there on the Ganges, we got the guitars out. We already knew each other from visiting each other's homes and the flats in London. But that's the only instruments they could bring, because there were no way to bring amps or drums for Ringo. And I played acoustic guitar all the time. In fact, Ringo used to say, "Don, you never stop playing guitar." And in that non-stop playing, after we meditated, after we ate our health food, after we chased the monkeys off the table, we would play. And as I picked, one day John said, "How do you do that?" I said, "What?" He said, "That guitar picking." I said, "Well, let me look," because I'd forgotten, actually. I was just doing it naturally. I'd forgotten the techniques. I just played a song. When I wrote a song, a new technique would be used, but I'd forget how I learned it. But I had to slow down the guitar picking to remember how I was taught. And I said to John, "I'll teach you. But it'll take a few days." He said, "I've got time, Don, here in the jungle." And so he did. And we sat down, and John learned it in 2 days. I took 3. Songwriting changes when you have a new style. And a completely new style opened up to John. And it was really cool to watch this. McCartney wouldn't sit down. He didn't want to learn sitting. He was walking around with his guitar. He'd walk in, he'd walk out, he'd walk into the jungle, he'd come back, he'd listen to what John was learning. And Paul's so smart. He's a genius, of course. And Paul picked it up by ear. And his particular picking, when he learned it, was completely different. A very, very unusual way he was using the guitar picking. And he got Blackbird and Mother Nature's Son. And John wrote Dear Prudence, Julia. But the White Album had a distinctive acoustic feel. But that was only the picking. Also, there was the chord structures that I had learned from flamenco, classical, early New Orleans blues, and folk, were chord structures that these 3 guys in the Beatles hadn't really experienced much. And the chord structures also entered the new songwriting. George wasn't so interested in the picking. He liked the chord structures because he was a budding songwriter under the great shadow of John and Paul, which is quite a big shadow. But he was moving into songwriting himself, and he wrote that beautiful While My Guitar Gently Weeps from the A minor, G, F sharp, F, and E pattern, which comes out of, classical music, New Orleans blues, and flamenco. And these styles and these chord structures, they wanted to learn them all. And it was really cool to pass these techniques on, not just for the White Album, but for the millions of their fans who would pick up a guitar and learn the same style from listening to John and Paul. And so it goes on. I learned it from my teacher, who learned it from his teacher, and I pass it on to those guys, and then they pass it on to millions of people. And that's how it works.
His backing musicians included the Jeff Beck Group and John Bonham, Jimmy Page, and John Paul Jones, who later rose to fame as members of Led Zeppelin. Donovan's commercial fortunes waned after parting with Most in 1969, and he left the industry for a time. Donovan continued to perform and record intermittently in the 1970s and 1980s. His musical style and hippie image were scorned by critics, especially after the rise of punk rock. His performing and recording became sporadic until a revival in the 1990s with the emergence of Britain's rave scene. He recorded the 1996 album Sutras with producer Rick Rubin, and in 2004 made a new album, Beat Cafe. Donovan was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2012 and the Songwriters Hall of Fame in 2014.
I was the kid on the scene then, because I was like 2 or 3 years younger, but I'd already put in a couple of years hitchhiking about, so I'd heard and met a few people. But it was in London when I was 16 or 17 that I ran into David Graham, Bert Jansch, John Martin briefly.
Did David Graham and did they belong to a beatnik thing? Was that were they?
Yeah.
They must have been quite a bit older than you were. They would.
Yeah. Well, what if the Stones and the Yardbirds and the Kinks and the Beatles in their own way in the Midlands were into the rhythm and blues club, I was into the folk club, but there was blues there too. But it was acoustic blues, and that would be Davy Graham and Bert Jansch. And when I ran into them, that was your folk scene. Now, I've realised in recent years that a lot of movements come out of art school in Britain, especially art school, because there may, in the late 50s or the mid-50s, there was a great encouragement by the government for the art schools. And what they thought maybe they were breeding painters, but actually they're breeding musicians. And I remember going to not art school, because I never went to the actual art school. We had the art class, and I knew a lot of art students in art school in St Albans. And in the common room, there was the records, the rare rhythm and blues record, the rare folk song, the rare this, the rare that. But it was very American, it's true. Our eye was towards America. But as we've seen in British popular music, the root is here. But some of the influences are rhythm and blues.
When you say the roots here, do you mean the root from centuries before, or the more recent root?
Well, when the Beatles played rhythm and blues, or I played what I considered a modern song, you could hear underneath it. There was a tradition to it. You get it a little bit with the Byrds in the States and with Neil Young and Dylan when they write. There's a root to their music. You can see it's very deep. And so what I mean is, although American music influenced Britain, the longest lasting, most successful music in the world seems to have been British. And I attribute it to a history of music, pre-Christian, almost like your old pagan Britain coming out through the music. A love of in fact, the balladeers and the music of the old sort of mysterious religion before Christianity was very famous in Europe. It seems to continue to be famous. Although you can hear rhythm and blues and rock and roll, their actual writing and the depth of feeling in the British writing seems to be very, very popular. And that's the next part of any conversation about British music being such an influence in the English-speaking world, is that there were these travellings from Ireland and Scotland, and that gospel and black music creates rhythm and blues. And in the South, especially in South of America, the United States, I mean, where you got a lot of immigration and you got a lot of mixture of Appalachian sort of people who were really owed their roots to Europe. I'm sure there's a lot of, there's French in the South, in the Florida region, and New Orleans, creating the Cajun music. And you've got French in the high north, in the mountains up in Canada. Yeah, I subscribe to that. I say that, yeah, the reason why country music goes down so well in Ireland and Scotland is because it's its natural home, almost.
A lot of your songs are, your bases, although you're aware of rock and roll, is really folk music. I mean, do you think that influence came from the Scottish thing, or did you pick that up later on when you...
Well, I thought I'd picked it up when I started listening to Joan Baez and Dylan when I was in the South here in school. But in recent years, or later years, I realised that I am the minstrel of these islands. If they said I was the British Bob Dylan, it wasn't clear enough. The real description is that I represent that old Scottish, Irish, well, mostly Scottish, situation of the one man with the one guitar and penning his own songs. And in my softer ballads about the land and about nature, on the albums that I've done, which I considered, well, they used to call children's records, actually they're ballads about the land, and the land is Scotland, and that's my upbringing. Although I was born in the city in a tenement, when I went into the greenery in the north of Scotland, I felt at home.